The overhead page crackled at 0547. Ashhole Cooper to supply closet 3. Snickers rippled across the nurse's station like a stone dropped in still water. Ashley Cooper didn't flinch. Didn't look up from the 4 lines she was priming. She finished the drip sequence, set the bag on the hook with the precision of someone who'd done this in the dark under mortar fire, and walked toward the supply closet with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. Seattle General in Norfolk sprawled across for city blocks, a sprawling monument to institutional beige and fluorescent urgency. The ER smelled like antiseptic mixed with burnt coffee and something underneath, that particular scent of bodies in crisis, copper and sweat and the acrid tang of fear. Ashley had learned to breathe through it years ago. She'd breathed through worse. Much worse. The hallway stretched 73 feet from the nurse's station to supply closet 3. She counted the steps without thinking. It was 0548 when she arrived. Dr. Caldwell was already inside, his polished shoes gleaming under the flickering lights like weapons. His presence made the air pressure change, the way certain people's proximity alters the chemistry of a room. 30 years as chief of surgery had taught him how to weaponize institutional space. He'd spent 2 decades cultivating a hierarchical system where his word was law, where his preferences shaped protocols, where his judgment was never questioned. Ashley Cooper didn't know this yet. But she was about to become the reason he lost sleep. "You see that?" His voice was knife-sharp, low enough that only she could hear. "That's what happens when you question my decisions. When you suggest changes. When you act like you know better than the doctors who actually carry credentials." Ashley's breathing remained measured. Her jaw didn't clench. She'd learned breath control in Helmand Province, where showing fear could get entire platoons killed. She'd learned it holding a TCCC manual in one hand and a dying operator's artery in the other. This was noise. This was institutional theater. This was a man whose only power was the ability to make people's employment precarious. "The trauma protocol update I rejected last month," Caldwell continued, his voice dropping another half octave, "was rejected for reasons. My reasons. I'm the chief of surgery. I've been here 28 years. You've been here how long? 4 years? 5. "For years and 3 months, Ashley said quietly. "Since September." "Exactly. You're a nurse. You follow protocols. You don't suggest rewrites to protocols. You don't stand in my department and imply that I'm outdated." The supply closet was narrow, 8 feet by 10, shelves rising on 3 sides like a canyon wall. Boxes of 14-gauge angiocath needles, suture kits, sterile gloves, trauma shears. All of it arranged with Ashley's own methodical precision. She'd reorganized this closet her first week, because chaos cost lives. Because in the military, every second saved was a soldier who made it home. Because muscle memory didn't forget just because she'd traded desert camouflage for hospital scrubs. "I didn't question your judgment, Dr. Caldwell. I asked if we'd reviewed the ACLS recommendations from the American College of Emergency Physicians." "That's not questioning you. It is questioning me. You made it sound like my protocols were obsolete. In front of the residents. That was insubordination." Ashley reached for a box of 4 tape, moving with the kind of fluid precision that would have made her former commanding officers nod in recognition. Everything controlled. Everything efficient. Nothing wasted. No emotion leaking into the physical body. That was the discipline. That was the only power she had left. The faded unit patch was sewn inside her jacket lining, tucked in the inner chest pocket where no one would see it. Special Forces insignia, worn soft with age, a relic of the woman she used to be. Major Ashley Cooper had led 17 men and women through 3 tours of Helmand Province. She'd extracted a wounded Delta operator from a village that was actively being shelled. She'd kept 3 operators breathing for 6 hours with field improvisation and pure determination while waiting for extraction. She'd earned the right to suggest things. She'd earned the right to question. But that was before the IED. Before the compound fracture of her left femur that never quite healed right. Before the medical discharge papers that said she was no longer deployable. Before she'd reinvented herself as a civilian nurse in Norfolk with a 4-year-old employment history and a limp that never went away. She touched the patch through the fabric, a private ritual that took 2 seconds. Caldwell didn't see it. He was still talking, his monologue gathering momentum like a man who'd never been interrupted in his professional life. There's a hierarchy here, Cooper. There's a system. And that system depends on respect. On people staying in their lane. On nurses being nurses and doctors being doctors. When you cross that line, when you suggest I'm not current on evidence-based medicine, when you do that in front of my residents, you undermine the entire structure. The rubber glove snapped as Ashley pulled a box of nitriles from the shelf. One sharp sound. Pop. It cut through his voice like punctuation. I understand, Dr. Caldwell. Do you? Because I'm not sure you do. I'm thinking maybe you need a reminder of your actual role. Maybe a conversation with HR about appropriate professional boundaries. Ashley turned to face him. The supply closet suddenly felt smaller. Her breathing was still even. Her eyes were still flat. But something in her posture had shifted, the way she held her shoulders, the way her weight balanced on her feet, the way her hands hung at her sides. It was the posture of someone who'd spent months learning to move through hostile territory without being seen. It was the posture of someone trained to end situations, not start them. Is there anything else, Dr. Caldwell? Her voice came out at a new register. Lower. Steadier. Like a radio frequency that had just been retuned. He saw it. He registered something in her face that made him step back, unconsciously, a half step toward the door. His jaw tightened. His hand moved to the door frame. He'd gotten used to people flinching. He'd gotten used to people backing down. Whatever he saw in Ashley's eyes in that moment, in that fluorescent-lit supply closet surrounded by the infrastructure of emergency medicine, it wasn't flinching. It wasn't backing down. It was the kind of composure that comes from having already lost everything that mattered and rebuilt from nothing. Just remember who makes the decisions here, he said, his voice slightly higher now, the knife edge of certainty replaced with something else. Something like the instinct an animal gets when it suddenly realizes the thing it was hunting might actually be the predator. Your employment depends on remembering that. He left. The door swung shut behind him with a soft pneumatic hiss. Ashley stood alone in the supply closet, surrounded by the tools of her current life. Tape and gauze and gloves and syringes. Everything sterile. Everything organized. Everything temporary. She reached inside her jacket and felt the unit patch through the cotton of her scrub top, the raised embroidery of a unit that no longer called her major, the insignia of a military she'd left behind but that had never left her. She took one breath. Then another. Then she picked up the box of angiocath needles and headed back to the nurse's station like nothing had happened. It was 0553. In 7 minutes, a multi-vehicle collision would flood Seattle General's ER beyond capacity. In 8 hours, she would save a man's life with nothing but an MRE package and the kind of field medicine they teach people who operate in places where helicopters can't land for 6 hours. In 12 hours, Dr. Caldwell would try to destroy her career. And in the end, the quietest person in the room would turn out to be the one holding it all together. But first, there were 3 more hours of routine. 3 more hours of restocking supplies and monitoring patients and maintaining the meticulous discipline that had kept her alive for 4 years since leaving the army. 3 more hours before everything changed. The other nurses glanced at her as she passed. None of them asked what had happened in the supply closet. None of them would have understood the language that had just been spoken there, the subliminal grammar of people who'd learned violence in different forms, who communicated threat and recognition in the spaces between words. Ashley organized the 4-line station with methodical precision, her movements carrying the weight of someone who understood that small competencies accumulated into survival. She didn't know that Dr. Caldwell was already calling 3 board members. She didn't know that he was beginning the systematic dismantling of her civilian life. She didn't know that in less than 12 hours, security would escort her out of Seattle General before dawn. But she would survive it. The same way she'd survived Helmand Province. The same way she'd survived everything else. Dr. Caldwell sat behind his mahogany desk, fingers steepled like a cathedral, as Ashley stood before him in the doorway of his office. The afternoon light filtered through the Venetian blinds, casting prison bars of shadow across his face. "You questioned my trauma protocol decision in front of the residents yesterday," he said, not looking up from the file in front of him. His voice carried the practiced condescension of a man who'd never been contradicted. "That update could wait. Your inexperience is showing." Ashley's jaw tightened, a barely perceptible flex, but she remained silent. The fluorescent lights hummed above them like angry insects. "Consider this your warning," he continued, finally meeting her eyes with the confidence of absolute institutional power. She had watched him for 3 weeks now, cataloguing his moves the way she'd once catalogued threats in a Helmand Province compound. Caldwell controlled the ER schedule, the resident assignments, 3 board members who owed him their positions, and the ear of the hospital administrator who played golf with him every Saturday. He was competent, methodical, and utterly certain of his dominance over the nursing staff. Ashley nodded once. "I understand, Doctor." 3 days later, the overhead page crackled at 1,400 hours, cutting through the ambient noise of the ER like a blade. "Ashhole Cooper to supply closet 3. Ashhole Cooper to supply closet 3. Laughter rippled through the nurses' station, not all of it. Some faces turned away in embarrassment. One young resident looked at his shoes. Ashley set down her clipboard, her movement steady and economical, and walked toward the supply closet like she was walking toward a briefing. She'd navigated worse than public mockery. She'd navigated mortar fire and ambushes, and the moment a 155mm shell landed 20 meters from her position in Sanjin Valley. A supply closet was nothing. She was nothing. That was the strategy. That was the survival. The closet smelled of antiseptic and cardboard. Dr. Caldwell stood in the narrow space between shelves, blocking the doorway like he owned it. He was taller than her by 4 inches, heavier by 60 pounds, and he carried the gravitational certainty of a man who had never once been physically intimidated. "Your insubordination is becoming a pattern," he hissed, stepping closer. His breath smelled like coffee and something metallic, blood pressure medication, probably. "I can make your life here unbearable, or I can make it short. Your choice. One more question about my decisions and you're gone. Do you understand me?" The threat wasn't veiled. It was explicit. Direct. The kind of institutional violence that didn't leave marks. Ashley took one measured breath, the kind she'd learned in Helmand Province when the air got thin and the world got loud. She met his eyes. Not with defiance. With the calm of someone who had genuinely survived worse. "I've survived worse men than you, Doctor." She stepped around him without breaking stride, her shoulder brushing past his, and she didn't flinch. Caldwell stood frozen, stunned by her composure. He'd expected tears or trembling or a broken apology. What he got was absolute silence as she walked back out into the ER. The quiet wasn't submission. It was restraint. It was the sound of a woman who understood exactly how to win without giving him the satisfaction of breaking. That Friday, as the evening shift arrived in the parking lot, Dr. Caldwell's voice boomed across the asphalt like a command broadcast. "Cooper!" A moment. 15 staff members turned to watch. The evening shift paused mid-stride, their conversation dying instantly. Caldwell stood beside his car, a black Mercedes sedan, registration tag reading Dr. 1, holding a mop and bucket as if they were ceremonial objects. "Effective immediately, you're reassigned to overnight janitorial duties," he announced, loud enough for the departing day shift to hear as they lingered in the parking lot. Someone's phone camera came out. "Your performance deficiencies require remediation before you can return to patient care." He extended the bucket toward her like a sword being presented for her defeat. The handle was wooden, worn smooth by thousands of hands. Rain had started to fall, light and persistent, turning the asphalt slick. Start tonight. You'll report to maintenance at 2,100 hours. The whispers started before he finished speaking. Not all of them were kind. Some carried the edge of schadenfreude, the quiet pleasure some people take in watching someone else's humiliation. Ashley felt the eyes on her. 16 sets of them. She watched Caldwell's face, saw the satisfaction there, the certainty that he had successfully neutralized a threat to his hierarchical kingdom. A single tear escaped her left eye. Just one. It traced down her cheek and fell onto the asphalt, where it joined the rain. She wiped it away without flinching, her hand steady as a surgical laser. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was 18 years of military discipline compressed into one moment of absolute control. She took the bucket from him without speaking. The plastic was cold and wet. I understand, Doctor. Her voice came out level, professional, devoid of the anger that would have satisfied him. She turned and walked to her car, the mop trailing behind her like a flag. The whispers followed her across the lot, mixing with the sound of rain and distant traffic. Nobody called out. Nobody offered sympathy. That was how institutional power worked. It moved like a contagion. One person targeted, and suddenly everyone else believed the targeting was deserved. She set the bucket and mop in the trunk of her 12-year-old Toyota Camry, closed the lid with a soft click, and sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. The rain hammered the windshield like applause. She pressed her palm against the jacket hanging on the passenger seat, the one with the unit patch sewn inside the lining, the symbol of who she used to be before the combat injury, before the medical discharge, before she'd become someone invisible enough to mock in a parking lot. Her breathing was controlled. Her hands were steady. But something in her chest had shifted. She had told herself for 3 weeks that she could absorb this. That she could be invisible and survive and rebuild. That staying quiet was the same as staying safe. But Caldwell didn't want her to be invisible. He wanted her to be gone. And he had the institutional power to make it happen. For days into her janitorial assignment, the night stretched behind her like a prison sentence. She'd mopped the ER corridors, the ICU hallways, the surgical wing floors. 240 square feet per hour, moving with the same precision she'd once applied to medical procedures. Her hands were raw. The bleach had stripped away the moisture, left the skin tight and burning. At 2,200 hours, as she was working the corridor outside Trauma Bay 3, the world changed. Tires scratched outside. Loud. Violent. The ambulance bay doors exploded open as paramedics wheeled in 7 gurneys from a multi-vehicle collision on the interstate. Mass casualty. All available personnel, someone shouted. The overhead page blared the massive transfusion protocol. Nurses scrambled. Residents emerged from the break room. Dr. Caldwell appeared from his office, barking orders with the confidence of a man orchestrating a symphony. Ashley set down her mop and moved instinctively toward the chaos, the muscle memory overriding everything else. 3 decades of training doesn't shut off just because someone hands you a bucket. Cooper, get back to your station, Caldwell snapped without looking at her. He didn't need to look. He knew she'd moved. He knew exactly where to target the next institutional strike. Ashley froze mid-step, watching nurses struggle with the patient load. In Trauma Bay 3, a man in his 40s lay on a gurney wearing a tactical vest, the kind military contractors wore in high-threat environments. His chest heaved with wet, labored breaths that came in quick succession. Blood bubbled from a puncture wound below his clavicle. The monitor screamed as his oxygen saturation plummeted. 89, 84. 78, the sound was a siren in the silence of his dying body. Ashley's eyes locked on the wound pattern. She'd seen this before. She'd treated this before. Under fire, with 60 seconds to decide between extraction and medical intervention. The man's lips were already turning blue. His fingers clutched at his chest, and she could see the exact moment his lung began to collapse. The tactical vest bore no unit markings, but she recognized the manufacturer, same spec ops supplier from every forward operating base in Helmand province. His eyes met hers across the chaos for one fraction of a second, and in that moment, something inside Ashley broke clean. Not her composure. Never her composure. But the part of her that had agreed to disappear. That had agreed to become invisible. A nurse rushed past carrying gauze and chest tubes toward another patient. Nobody else was moving toward Bay 3. Caldwell was coordinating the other 6 patients, delegating with precision, deliberately leaving the veteran unattended. Ashley's hand reached toward the patch inside her jacket, her breathing shifting into a rhythm she hadn't used in 3 years. Combat breathing. The kind that came before everything else. The kind that made time slow down and noise fade to a single, crystalline point of focus. For days into mopping the corridor at Seattle General, Ashley's hands moved through their rhythm, back, forward, ring, repeat, when the world changed. The doors to the ambulance bay didn't just open. They exploded inward with the violence of a tactical breach, paramedics flooding the ER with stretchers, with screaming, with the kind of chaos that made every other nurse's movements go frantic and small. Tires had screeched outside like wounded animals. A multi-vehicle collision on I-64, the paramedic shouted, 5 vehicles, unknown number of critical patients, ETA on transport 4 and 5 in 90 seconds. The ER transformed from order to overwhelmed in the space of her next breath. Nurses abandoned their stations. Doctors materialized from offices, moving with that particular blend of urgency and dread that meant the hospital was about to exceed capacity. Ashley didn't move. She kept mopping. The first stretcher rolled past her, a woman with a compound fracture, her leg bent at an angle nature never intended. The second carried a man whose face was half covered in blood, his breathing shallow and wet. A child. Another adult. The bay doors kept opening, kept disgorging wounded, and the steady hum transformed into something that sounded like a helicopter landing inside a metal box. She'd seen worse. Helmand Province, summer of 2012, IED detonation 30 meters from the convoy. 18 casualties evacuated from Sanjin Valley on a single Black Hawk. But that was then, and this was now, and now she was a janitor with a mop, not a major with a trauma bag, and those identities couldn't occupy the same space. A nurse bumped into her, apologizing without slowing down. The fluorescent light seemed to buzz louder, or maybe that was just the adrenaline rewiring her nervous system. Pain is information, she'd learned years ago, and right now her body was screaming one word, ready. Dr. Caldwell's voice cut through the chaos, barking orders toward the trauma bays. His competence was obvious, the tone of someone who'd trained for this even if he hadn't executed it in a decade. Surgical oversight, administrative meetings, board presentations, those had become his world. But the voice underneath the rust was still a surgeon's voice, still knew how to command a room. Then the bay doors opened again, and everything changed. The stretcher came through fast, paramedics calling vitals with the clipped precision of people who'd seen the worst. Male patient, mid-50s, catastrophic chest trauma, sucking chest wound on the right anterior thorax, heart rate dropping from 118 to 92 to 76. A tactical vest hung open on his shoulders, the kind of gear worn by people who existed in classified spaces. An MRE pouch was visible in the side pocket. His breathing was labored, the sound like wet paper tearing. The monitors they wheeled him to started its alarm patterns, beeping, then faster, then the particular shriek that meant something was fundamentally wrong with how oxygen was moving through his system. A nurse called out, "We're losing him." Third bay, now. Ashley watched Dr. Caldwell move toward the veteran's bedside. Watched him glove up, his hands trembling just slightly as he reached for the chest tube kit. The paralysis was visible, a surgeon who'd spent 15 years in meetings instead of trauma bays, whose hands knew what to do but whose nervous system had forgotten how to execute under pressure. He opened the kit with movements that belonged to someone reading instructions for the first time. The veteran's monitor started its descent. 142, 98. 76, 52. The patient's eyes were open, aware of what was happening, aware that the machinery in his chest wasn't working anymore. "I need, someone get me," Caldwell's voice cracked, and that was when Ashley understood. He wasn't going to save this man. He was going to watch him die, and he was going to do it while holding the tools that could have prevented it. She was 5 feet away, still holding her mop. Something shifted. The weight of 15 years, the discharge papers she'd signed, the civilian life she'd rebuilt, none of it mattered. What mattered was a man coding in front of her, and a surgeon whose fear was going to kill him. Ashley dropped the mop. It clattered against the tile with a sound like a weapon being discarded. She crossed the distance between herself and the gurney in 3 seconds, her movements carrying the muscle memory of 1,000 trauma scenarios. "What the hell are you?" Caldwell started, but she was already moving his gloved hands aside. Her hands found the veteran's tactical vest, tore it open with the kind of controlled violence that comes from practice. The MRE package in the side pocket, vacuum-sealed plastic, exactly what she needed. She ripped the outer packaging with her teeth, tore the inner plastic into a square roughly the size of her palm. The sucking chest wound was drawing air on every inhalation, the sound like a vacuum hissing open. She placed the plastic square directly over it, leaving one corner unsealed for air to escape, and secured 3 sides with medical tape from the cart. 40 seconds. The entire procedure took 40 seconds. She reached for the crash cart without asking permission, grabbed a 14-gauge angiocath needle, and performed the needle decompression at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Air hissed out, the sound of pressure equalizing, of the patient's chest cavity receiving permission to expand again. The oxygen saturation climbed. 78, 81, 85, 90. The heart rate stabilized at 94. Ashley stepped back. Her hands were covered in blood. The veteran's eyes met hers for one moment, and in that moment something passed between them, recognition, maybe. The kind of understanding that only exists between people who've faced the version of death that wears a uniform. "You just ended your career," Caldwell whispered. He was already reaching for his phone, his fingers shaking with something that might have been rage or might have been the shock of watching someone move with absolute authority in a space where he'd just stood frozen. His lips moved with words like unauthorized procedures and reckless endangerment, and I have 3 board members on speed dial. The 2 nurses who'd witnessed everything suddenly found the floor very interesting. Neither would meet Ashley's eyes, and she understood. They'd seen what she'd done. They'd also seen who she'd done it to, and they'd calculated their own survival odds accordingly. The veteran was stable. The monitor showed a steady sinus rhythm, the lines climbing and falling in the reassuring pattern of a body returning to itself. The man who'd been drowning in his own blood 60 seconds ago was now breathing on his own, oxygen saturation climbing past 95, the color returning to his face like a photograph developing in reverse. But that wasn't the worst part. That was when she saw something in the veteran's eyes shift, not fear, but recognition of a different kind. The way his gaze tracked her movements with the precision of someone trained in observation. The way his breathing steadied not just from the medical intervention, but from understanding that the person who'd saved him was the kind of person who knew exactly what she was doing. The tactical vest. The MRE. The absolute certainty of her movements. He knew what she was. And from the way his eyes moved toward Caldwell, assessing the threat in her antagonist the way a soldier assesses terrain, Ashley understood that this veteran operated in worlds she'd thought she'd left behind. Caldwell was still on his phone. I don't care if she saved his life. Protocols exist for a reason. No, listen to me. I want her credentials pulled before shift change. The veteran's hand reached out, grabbed Ashley's wrist with surprising strength for someone who'd been coding 60 seconds earlier. His voice was hoarse, damaged, but the words were clear. "What's your name, Lieutenant?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. But she also couldn't break the grip, couldn't pull away from that recognition without confirming what they both knew, and confirming it would be the same as detonating the last bomb she'd carefully defused. Caldwell was giving instructions now, his voice taking on the quality of someone who'd realized he could reshape this situation into his advantage. Unauthorized procedures. Patient interference. A reckless nurse who'd contaminated a sterile field with her hysteria. None of it was true. All of it was going to stick. The MRE package crinkled in Ashley's hands, tan canvas with black lettering. Meals ready to eat. She'd assembled these field dressings in Helmand Province with her eyes closed, muscle memory etched into her forearms like scars. The veteran's chest heaved, air whistling through the sucking wound below his collarbone. Blood pooled across the trauma bay floor, dark and urgent. Her fingers moved before thought caught up. Tear. Fold. Seal. 40 seconds. The plastic adhered to wet skin, forming an airtight barrier as his oxygen saturation climbed, 68, 72, 79, 84. Breathing. Living. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm as she stepped back, her scrub soaked red to the elbows, and Dr. Caldwell stood motionless at the bedside like a statue someone had forgotten to animate. Nobody asked questions in that moment. The code team moved around her like she was part of the machinery, part of the room itself. The veteran's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and terrified, and his hand reached for her wrist. His grip was weak but certain. Recognition. She understood that language, the language of men who'd been brought back from the edge by someone who knew exactly where that edge was. Ashley met his eyes without flinching. "You're stable," she said quietly. "You made it." Those 3 words held the weight of triage decisions made under fire, of bodies carried across 400 meters of open ground, of holding pressure on wounds while helicopters screamed overhead. The man's pupils dilated. He saw something in her face he hadn't seen in any civilian nurse, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. Within an hour, the doors to Seattle General's east entrance swung open and 2 men in charcoal suits entered like they owned the building. Their shoulders were too broad for the blazers. Their hands hung at angles that suggested muscle memory of different weight distributions. Classified credentials flashed at the charge nurse. "We need to speak with whoever treated the patient in Bay 3. Not a request. An imperative." Ashley was washing blood from her hands in the staff bathroom, the water running pink, then clear, when a junior nurse named Marcus found her. "There are federal agents asking for you," he said, and his voice carried the tremor of someone who'd never been that close to official authority. She dried her hands on the paper towel dispenser and followed him to a private consultation room that smelled like old coffee and drywall. The taller operative sat across from her at a metal table scarred with coffee rings. His partner stood by the window, jaw working like he was processing information in real time. "Walk us through treatment," the seated one said. His accent carried the flatland drawl of the Midwest, Nebraska, maybe South Dakota. Ashley described the wound pattern, entry velocity, tissue damage, the angle of penetration consistent with fragmentation trauma. She explained the decision to use external pressure rather than direct packing, the reasoning behind the chest seal placement. Her voice remained level, clinical, the language precise. "You assessed this like someone who's treated combat casualties," the operative said quietly. "Not a question. A statement of fact." His eyes narrowed slightly. "You've done this before." Under fire. The room contracted around her. She could taste copper, old blood, or her own fear. She couldn't distinguish anymore. Before her throat could close entirely, before the silence could become a confession, the door opened. Dr. Caldwell entered with 2 security guards flanking him like a military formation. His expression had transformed, no longer the calculating administrator, but something sharper. Something predatory. "This interview is over," he announced, his voice carrying the theatrical sympathy of a man about to deliver a diagnosis. "Ms. Cooper has been terminated effective immediately for performing unauthorized medical procedures without physician oversight or written consent." The operatives exchanged glances, a 3-second conversation that happened in pure eye contact. Caldwell continued, "I've already called the board. 3 members who owe me their positions have signed the termination paperwork. There is no appeal process." He turned to Ashley with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Security will escort you to collect your personal belongings." The locker room was fluorescent and humming. She moved through it like a diver moving through water, everything slowed, everything deliberate. Her employee badge came off first, the lanyard sliding over her head. Her stethoscope. Her phone charger. The faded unit patch she kept hidden in the jacket lining, she'd forgotten it there. She left it. Some things needed to stay buried. Her scrubs went last. She folded each piece with parade ground precision, the top first, sleeves aligned, then the bottoms, creases sharp enough to cut. 16 years of muscle memory didn't abandon you just because the hierarchy decided you weren't valuable anymore. It stayed in your hands. It waited. At 0400 hours, the hospital laundry room was empty except for the hum of industrial dryers and the percussion of a loose coin spinning in one of the machines. Ashley stood at the folding table with her final shift of scrubs, the ones that had blood on them, the ones she'd rinsed in the staff bathroom before clocking out. They hung damp and cold. She folded them anyway, each piece receiving the same attention, the same respect, the same ritual she'd performed with her dress uniform before deployment. The fabric was soft against her palms. Hospital issue. Commodity. Nothing like the Class A she'd worn to stand in formation, nothing like the digital camouflage she'd bled through in Helmand. But her hands didn't know the difference. Her hands only knew how to fold. How to prepare. How to maintain discipline when everything else was falling apart. She placed the folded scrubs on the counter, stacked them in a precise column, and ran her fingers over the fabric one final time. The dryer rumbled. Thunder in a basement. Outside, Norfolk was still asleep, 4 a.m. in late autumn, the rain from yesterday still hanging in the air, the streets empty of everyone except the people who worked nights in rooms no one else ever saw. The medically discharged major who had rebuilt her entire existence from wreckage, who had learned to smile and nod and call herself just a nurse, who had folded herself so small she nearly disappeared, had lost the last piece of ground she was standing on. She walked out into the dark parking lot. Her car was in the north section, where the overnight staff parked. She didn't look back at the building. Some doors, once they close, weren't meant to be reopened from the inside. The next morning came too fast and too bright. Administrator Helen Marsh's office occupied the corner of the third floor. All windows and glass surfaces that reflected everything back at you, made everything visible. Ashley sat in the chair across from Marsh's desk at 0900 hours, her jaw tight, waiting to surrender the badge. Caldwell stood beside the administrator's desk like a principal at a school disciplinary hearing. The papers were already printed, termination effective immediately, severance contingent on non-disclosure agreement, benefits terminated as of 1600 hours. Marsh slid them across the desk with the expression of someone performing a necessary cruelty. The door burst open. Her son Derek stood in the frame, 16 years old and trembling, carrying something she'd hidden so carefully he'd had to find it himself. A shadow box. Dark wooden frame, glass front, inside it everything she'd spent 12 years trying to forget. Medals on ribbon bars. The Bronze Star, small and deceptively heavy. The Purple Heart. The Combat Medical Badge. And below them, engraved on a brass nameplate in letters that looked like accusations, Major Ashley Cooper, United States Army Special Forces. Derek's voice cracked as he spoke. "Mom, they need to see these." He set the shadow box on the administrator's desk like he was placing the evidence. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum. Marsh's hand flew to her mouth. A nurse named Patricia, who'd been filing something in the corner, dropped the folder she was holding. Paper scattered across the floor in a cascade, discharge documents, personnel files, a DD-214 form that bore Ashley's name and service record in black ink. Patricia knelt with trembling hands, picking up the discharge form, her fingers shaking so violently she nearly dropped it again. "Oh my God," she whispered. She was, the words wouldn't come. Dr. Caldwell's face drained of color. He snatched the folder from Patricia's hands, scanning it rapidly, his lips moving without sound, like he was trying to make the words disappear if he just read them fast enough. The door opened again. The veteran from Bay 3 stepped through it, and beside him walked 2 men in Navy service dress uniforms, gold tridents gleaming on their chests. SEALs. The room shifted on its axis. The taller one, a commander whose name tape read Richards, stepped forward and began to speak, his voice like a tank idling in a garage, steady and immovable and absolutely certain. 2 Bronze Stars with Valor device, Richard said, and his eyes never left Caldwell's face. Purple Heart. Combat Medical Badge. Major Cooper ran into enemy fire in Helmand Province to extract 3 wounded operators and held them alive for 6 hours under sustained mortar attack. Hospital staff had gathered in the doorway now, phones out, recording. Richards continued without pause. She took shrapnel to her left leg and continued treating casualties until exfil arrived. She was medically discharged after complications from her injuries. What she did in Bay 3 yesterday, that was nothing. That was muscle memory for her. That was just Tuesday. Derek stood beside his mother, tears streaming down his face, and the silence that followed was the loudest sound Ashley had ever heard. 2 FBI agents entered, the kind of agents who'd already briefed their superiors before they arrived, who knew exactly what they were walking into. "We need Major Cooper's assistance on a classified operation," the lead agent announced, his credentials already open, already showing. "The patient treated in Bay 3 is Presidential Security Advisor Michael Torres. His protection detail has requested her by name for medical support on an upcoming mission." Caldwell tried to speak but no sound came. He backed toward the wall like something was advancing on him, which it was, truth, moving at the speed of light, rewriting everything he'd built. The newsroom at WNOR smelled like burnt coffee and the particular anxiety of a Tuesday morning where nothing was going according to plan. Dr. Caldwell arrived at 11 o'clock sharp, moving through the glass doors with the confidence of a man who'd spent 30 years operating unopposed, suit pressed, hair colored, smile practiced in a mirror. He'd called in a favor with morning anchor Christine Reeves, someone whose daughter's tuition he'd once helped fund through a hospital board donation. 20 minutes later, he was in makeup, watching his reflection become sharper, more trustworthy, more believable. The segment was supposed to be about trauma protocol updates. By the time they went live at noon, Caldwell had redirected the entire narrative. The cameras focused on his jawline while he leaned forward, voice steady as a surgeon's hand before the first incision. "Christine, I need to address something that occurred at Seattle General last night. A reckless nurse with delusions of heroism performed unauthorized procedures that could have killed a patient." He paused, letting the words settle into 14 million living rooms across the region. "This individual has fabricated a military background to justify her behavior. As chief of surgery, I had no choice but to terminate her immediately to protect patient safety." The anchor shifted in her seat. Something flickered across her face, discomfort, maybe doubt. But she didn't interrupt. The phones at the station began lighting up. Social media picked up the story in real time. #reckless nurse began trending. Screenshots of Caldwell's face filled Twitter feeds. He was winning. For exactly 8 more minutes, he was absolutely winning. Then Christine's producer handed her a note. Her eyes widened as she read it. "Dr. Caldwell, we have a caller. Lieutenant General Marcus Hyland, U.S. Army Special Operations Command." Caldwell's composure faltered for just a fraction of a second, a ripple across the surface of a pond right before the stone hits bottom. The general's voice filled the studio like authority incarnate, measured and cold. "I'm watching your interview, Doctor. Major Ashley Cooper served under my command for 8 years. She is one of the most decorated combat medics in Special Forces history." The word major hung in the air, heavy as a pronouncement. Caldwell opened his mouth. Nothing came out. "She holds 2 Bronze Stars with Valor," the general continued, "each medal its own sentence, its own weapon. Earned by running into direct fire to save lives." The anchor's jaw was working, trying to process what she was hearing. A Purple Heart. Another pause. Combat Medical Badge. The general's voice dropped lower, taking on the particular timbre of a man describing something sacred. In Helmand Province, she ran into a firefight under active mortar fire to extract 3 wounded operators. She held them alive for 6 hours while waiting for medevac. 3 men went home to their families because of her. Caldwell's face turned the color of old brick. His hands were gripping the armrest. Sweat beaded at his temples. "You attempted to bury the record of a war hero," the general said. You publicly slandered her on television. And you did it because she made you look incompetent when you froze during a trauma you couldn't handle. The studio was so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum overhead. I forwarded her complete service record to your hospital board, along with affidavits from 3 SEAL team leaders who are alive because of her medical expertise. Expect a call from the Secretary of Defense within the hour. You attempted to destroy someone far better than you'll ever be. That was a significant mistake. The line went dead. Not a click, just silence, the kind of silence that happens when the world stops turning for exactly 3 seconds and everyone forgets to breathe. Christine turned to camera, her professionalism reasserting itself like muscle memory. We're taking a break. When we return, but nobody was listening to the return. They were watching Caldwell's hand shake as he reached up to loosen his tie. His mouth opened and closed like a fish discovering water could betray it. Within 2 hours, the hospital board placed Caldwell on administrative leave pending investigation. His wife served him divorce papers that evening. She'd watched the broadcast at her law office, surrounded by colleagues, all of them knowing. By dawn, his medical license was under review by the state board. The ER nurses came forward with documented accounts of his paralysis during the veteran's trauma, of how a bedside nurse had to save a patient while the chief of surgery stood frozen. 14 million viewers had watched his credibility evaporate in real time. There was no way to rebuild that. 6 months later, Ashley walked through the strip mall parking lot adjacent to Seattle General, sunlight cutting through the November air at an angle that made everything look cleaner than it was. Her hospital badge hung from a lanyard, reading Dr. Ashley Cooper, Director of Trauma Services. She'd completed her doctorate through a military veteran scholarship program, 3 years compressed into 18 months because she'd learned long ago how to function on 4 hours of sleep and pure purpose. The hospital board had created the director position specifically for her, their way of apologizing for what should never have been necessary. She carried a briefcase of curriculum materials for the combat medic training program launching next month. 30 veterans and active duty soldiers were enrolled in the first cohort. The waiting list already had 72 names. Near the nail salon, she spotted him. Dr. Caldwell sat at a folding table beneath a banner reading "Discount Insurance, ask me how" in letters that had started to peel at the edges. He was in a rumpled polo shirt, the kind you buy at a discount store because you no longer have the resources for anything else. His face had aged. His hand shuffled through pamphlets nobody wanted. One disinterested customer stood at the edge of the table, asking about coverage for a root canal. Their eyes met for half a second. Ashley didn't break stride. Didn't slow. Didn't acknowledge the man who tried to erase her. She continued into the hospital, where Derek waited in the conference room, 16 years old now, shadowing her today, interested in emergency medicine. He'd watched his mother lose everything and rebuild it without breaking. He was going to be a good doctor. Presidential Security Advisor Torres sat in her office for a follow-up appointment, his chest fully healed, the scar tissue beneath his shirt a map of survival. General Hyland sends his regards, he said. He wants you to know the program you're building will save more lives than you can count. Ashley nodded once, touching the faded unit patch now displayed in a frame on her wall beside her medical degree. The patch that had cost her everything. The patch that had saved her. That evening, she stood before 30 new combat medic trainees in the hospital auditorium of veterans and active duty, men and women who'd seen the worst of humanity and chosen to heal anyway. Their eyes followed her with the particular attentiveness of soldiers who recognize command presence. You've seen things that most people will never have to process, she told them, her voice steady as a surgical laser. You've made decisions under pressure that civilians spend their whole lives never having to make. Never apologize for the quiet strength that got you through. Never diminish it because it isn't loud enough for the world to hear. She paused, letting her gaze move across the room. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. Outside, through the window, she could see the strip mall parking lot across the street. Dr. Caldwell was loading his folding table into the back of a Honda Civic that had seen better decades. She didn't look twice. Subscribe for more stories about the quiet strength that changes everything.